we're going to take this one from Annulment Proof. Annulment Proof is asking, what do you need to be capable of in order to consent to marriage, Father? And also, is it required to get your bishop's permission to divorce? That's kind of Catholics aren't allowed to divorce. I don't know if he's referring to annulment, which is not divorce, but we'll talk about that, the distinction, I guess.
Well, first of all, what do you need to be capable of in order to consent to marriage? Well, to be honest, it's not really that hard to consent to marriage. People have been doing it for thousands of years. The first marriage was between Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And throughout all of the Old Testament, the New Testament, since Christ established the church, there have been people that have gotten married. There's three things that are required for any valid marriage. The three things that are necessary for any marriage is they have to be open to children. They have to intend to be faithful for life. In other words, no divorce. They have to intend to be exclusively faithful to that spouse. And those things all make sense. We can go back to the Garden of Eden. We can see in God establishing marriage that without stability, a family cannot survive. Children don't have the confidence that they need, that their parents are always going to be there. The spouses don't have the security they need, knowing that their spouse is going to be faithful exclusively to them till death do they part. So these three things would be necessary for any valid marriage. As far as for consent, well, you basically have to be able to give consent to this lifelong contract, covenant, agreement, sacrament, without any fear or force. So fear or force would take away a person's ability to give consent. But nowadays, some people almost want to make it into such a difficult thing that almost nobody could give valid consent. And that's not the case. God made it pretty easy for two people to get married, since he made most people for marriage. You also ask, is it required to get your bishop's permission to divorce? And as Rudy said, it's not just Catholics, but Christ said that whoever divorces and remarries another is guilty of adultery. So divorce has always been something that has been against marriage because it goes against one of those three essential things, that stability for life. We're not permitted to get divorced. What canon law says is that there could be reasons for a temporary separation if there is abuse, severe neglect, something like that. Certainly danger to the spouse or the children. The spouse in danger should get out of danger's way. And but normally, what canon law says, when a husband and wife are married, they have the obligation to live a common life, to share a house, to share a marriage bed. And if they think that they need to separate for some temporary reason, then canon law says that you need the bishop's permission for that. But that's to prevent divorce. And that's one of the reasons why the church says you can't just decide, well, we're going to split up for a while and see if things get better. No, it's a very serious thing, since you are normally obligated to share that common life. And so that's why the bishop's permission, according to canon law, has to be sought even before the couple would separate. But this doesn't include temporary separations, like if one of the spouses is going on a business trip or going to visit relatives for a week or something like that. But we're talking actually separating. So that's what I think annulment proof is asking, because, if you went to the bishop and said, I'd like to get divorced, he's going to say, what did Christ say? No divorce. But there could be reasons for temporary separation, and that you should seek the bishop's permission for.
Well, speaking of permission, though, Father, I think this is one of those terms or one of those topics that gets thrown around, and people tend to paint with a broad brush and say that annulments are given out like candy these days. What do you think about that statement? Do you think that's true, or is that just kind of like a case-by-case, diocese-by-diocese basis?
When I was growing up, stories that I heard was that in some places, yes, it was easy to get an annulment. It seems from the stories I've heard that sometimes there wasn't very much review by the tribunals to see if there actually was a valid marriage. I mean, what the tribunal's job isn't to say, yeah, you can get divorced, you have it bad, go ahead and get divorced. No, the tribunal's only job is to look at the marriage and say, was there one of those three things missing at the time of the marriage that would have made it an invalid marriage? So the tribunal doesn't grant divorces. It would examine the marriage, and then it could grant a declaration of nullity. In other words, there was something essential missing, so that marriage never existed. Or they might say, no, we assume that marriage is valid because, like I said at the beginning, it's not that hard to get married. We don't need a PhD in marriage counseling. Now, having preparation for marriage greatly increases the bond of the marriage. Studies have found across all different types of marriages, even secular marriages outside of the Catholic Church, where you're not talking about Catholics, but you're talking about two Protestants or two Jews or whatever. If they have any amount of marriage preparation, it decreases the divorce rate by quite a bit. So marriage preparation is important. But having said that, you don't need to have a PhD to be able to give consent for marriage. So to answer your question, Rudy, about the marriage process, it does seem that the Code of Canada Law 1983 seemed to widen some of the grounds for marriage. And I think this is where some of the issues come in, because some of those grounds that maybe weren't even considered previous to that give some more options. But ultimately, the theology of marriage can't change. And if there were places that were easily granting annulments, well, that shame on them. The dioceses that I've worked with as a priest, I have not found that to be the case. In fact, I've found that it's not easy to have a declaration of nullity, and it certainly is not a quick, simple thing, unless there's something very obvious. But usually, there's lots of interviews. They have to go through a process of having a defender of the bond try to defend the bond and kind of be like the devil's advocate for the marriage. And so, yes, I think there are some places maybe that was the case, and maybe still are, but I don't think it's universal.